intentionally drawing attention to Apollo in this polemic. So within this inclusio, the second prong of the literary analysis is a series of interlocking wordplays. The Sibyl uses three motifs here: land, water, and air, and interlocks them, creating a direct thread from Artemis to Apollo. These wordplays are interlocked as the key term for the next wordplay is embedded in the current one. This is not readily obvious in the English translation, but is much more apparent in the original Greek. So the land-based motif of earthquakes was established in the opening woes, as previously noted. The application of this motif is then immediately transferred to Artemis with the prediction that the well-grounded, and you hear the wordplay on the land motif, that the temple of Artemis will fall to the sea with cleavings and earthquakes. This particular text seems not to be coincidental, as it mirrors the terms used by Pliny the Elder in mentioning the rationale for the site selection for her temple. In his Natural History, Pliny observes that a marshy soil outside or at Ephesus was selected for the site of the Artemision expressly and intentionally so that it would not suffer from earthquakes or the chasms which they produce. The Sibyl has reversed this order of these terms here, chasms and earthquakes. Assuming the book 5 was written about 4 or 5 decades after Pliny's Natural History, it is entirely possible that the Sibyl was aware of this earthquakes, chasms rationale and used this strategically against Artemis. The link from the land-based motif to the sea-based motif is present, as here the temple will fall into the sea. The Sibyl then presents the sea-based attack using Allah, the sea, to transition to the nautically based motif. I've used that word nautically intentionally because there's a phonetic element to this particular motif. Here, the temple, Naos, here the temple will fall into a sea, and it'll fall headfirst as the storms overwhelm the ships, the Naos. The temple, Neon, will be sought, but it will be a temple that no longer is there. The root here is Neotao. As the motif then shifts to the sky, the same root, Neotao, is used, contrasting the temple of Artemis that is no longer dwelling there with the imperishable God who is dwelling in the sky. And so there's a phonetic-based motif that's here that now transitions to the sky-based motif with the word Aether. So the next wordplay is not as easily seen as it is spread across a number of verses here from 298 to 310. But the image of the imperishable God dwelling in the air is then contrasted with foolish Kume. Foolish Kume, who will no longer, again, Uketi, as was used previously, no longer will take her chariot to the sky, again, Aether. So we start to see the wordplay turning to the sky motif. And there are two parts of this visual that connect to Apollo. The first, of course, is the image of the chariot passing through the air, as was understood of Apollo. And the second is foolish Kume, which has a close connection to Apollo's oracular site at Didyma. So without using the name of Apollo, the connections are already starting to point directly to Apollo through foolish Kume. So indeed it is foolish Kume that brings us, that is the link to the final motif that brings us back to the nautically based wordplays. We've gone from the earth to the sea, to the sky, and now back to the sea. So in wrapping up the sky-based motif, foolish Kume is mentioned as having divinely inspired streams. And the root here again now is na'o. You hear the phonetic motif coming up once again. Some have questioned whether this is a reference to Kume in Italy with its streams of water. Perhaps that is in the background as part of the cleverness of the wordplay. However, the full context here suggests Kume of Asia Minor. Not only are these streams divinely inspired, Theopneustos, but these streams are where she will remain as a corpse in the swelling streams, and swelling has its root right here, kuma, which strikes me again as a phonetic connection here, as I'm starting to see this, I'm looking at the cleverness, which then leads me to believe the intentionality of the Sibyl in these interlocking wordplays. So, Cumae is highlighted because her residents sought advice from Apollo at Didyma in a well-known account recorded by Herodotus. We'll mention that in just a moment. But before we get to Cumae, we can review the interlocking wordplays developed by the Sibyl. From the well-grounded temple of Artemis, the Sibyl used a land-based play on words that transitioned to a sea-based play on words, again demonstrating the downfall of Artemis and her temple. The Sibyl then made an interlocking pivot to the air, incorporating two images that evoked Apollo, then ending with a reprise of the nautically based wordplay, this time applying it directly to Apollo. So the artistry and cleverness of these wordplays suggest intentionality on the part of the Sibyl. So with that in mind, it is to the temple at Didyma that we turn next, as introduced by Foolish Cumae. So for the remainder of this presentation, we will turn our attention from the literary analysis to the historic, geographic, and material evidence, pointing to Didyma as the target of the Sibyl. The key link, as mentioned here, is Foolish Cumae. It's possible that this draws upon an explicit historic record linking Cumae with Didyma, which comes from Herodotus in his histories. There, Herodotus records that Pactyus, a Lydian general, had fled Cyrus the Great during the Persian Wars and had sought refuge in the city of Cumae. Unsurprisingly, Cyrus issued an edict calling for the return of Pactyus, placing the Cumaeans in an obviously difficult spot. For advice, they sent a delegation southward to Didyma. The response from the oracle was to hand over Pactyus, which then prompted a rather entertaining and tempestuous counter from Aristodicus, which is out of the scope of today's discussion, but it is still worth a read if you haven't read it yet, and many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with this. The main point here is that Cumae was well known for their connection to Didyma. Such a reference calls to mind this account and evokes Didyma here. In his histories, Herodotus also refers to others who sought counsel from Apollo at Didyma. Crassus is of special note as the same one who funded the building of the temple of Artemis, again drawing connections from Artemis to Apollo. The evocation of the Cumaeans, as recorded in Herodotus, calls to mind this connection between Artemis and Apollo and their respective temples. The written record of Pausanias connects the temples of both Artemis and Apollo. He first mentions the sanctuary of Artemis and then the two sanctuaries of Apollo, referring first to the one in Milesian territory, that is, Didyma. Strabo also refers to the oracle of Apollodorus near Miletus. So the historic record clearly connects, or closely connects, Cumae with Didyma, connects the temple of Artemis at Ephesus with the temple of Apollo at Didyma, and connects the temple of Apollo at Didyma with Miletus. And those connections are key to the Sibyl's polemic, to the Sibyl's linked polemic. The connection of Didymus to Miletus is important geographically. We've already gotten into this particular territory. As the Sibyl describes the land which she would never willingly take as the land that is the neighboring land of Phoebus. Using the name of Phoebus, again another name for Apollo, naturally evokes Apollo. The Sibyl then proceeds to predict the destruction of Miletus, clearly implying that Miletus is the neighboring land of Phoebus. Again, without mentioning the name Didyma, the Sibyl is referring to Didyma, is the point. So this implication is clearly supported geographically. Didyma is only about 12 miles south of Miletus. Claros, another oracular site of Apollo, is about 46 miles north of Miletus, about 4.5 times the distance away. Clearly Didyma and Miletus were the neighbors, and even more, Didyma was connected to Miletus by the Sacred Way, that 12-mile road. Didyma is closer to Miletus than Claros, connected by the Sacred Way. The neighboring land of Phoebus is the reference to Apollo. The two temples, the one of Artemis and one of Apollo, are linked architecturally. The Milesians, their goal, the goal of the Milesians was to build a temple that would rival any other temple in size and magnificence. They came close to doing so. The architect of the Artemis temple at Ephesus also worked on Apollo's temple. There's a connection as well. And for the size and grandeur of the temple of Artemis, the temple of Apollo at Didyma was nearly equal to, or even greater in some dimensions. At Didyma, the height of the columns is higher than those of Artemis, and the area within the colonnade also is a greater area. Some pictures here of the temple of Didyma. You can see relative to me, how tall they are. But they are. It's quite an amazing sight. I had the privilege of visiting Didyma this summer. There are a couple in the back here, Keith and Sharon, who were there as well, and enjoyed that very much. I enjoyed the travel with them. We traveled with Tutu educational tours and got to meet the site. It's really quite an amazing site, and you can see the breadth and the magnificence of this temple, and especially relative to that of the temple in Ephesus, of which we want to see one column now. So this is from the outside of the temple of Didyma, and this is taken from inside the area. You can see how huge it is, how massive the structure is. Some have suggested that if we, by looking at this temple of Apollo Didyma, that we can picture what the temple in Ephesus looked like. And so you get a bit of a picture here. Finally, we get to some material evidence that connects these two quite closely. So Fontenrose, in his lifetime work on Didyma, places Artemis and her cult there at Didyma in great standing, not just placing her, but placing her in great standing, linked to Apollo. He points out these six notes here. Number one, she was the deity most venerated at Didyma, only after Apollo. Her cult at Didyma was as old as Apollo's there, and probably was there from the very founding of the Didyman temple. There is a sanctuary to Artemis at Didyma near the sacred way. Sacrifices and offerings, there's evidence that they were made to Artemis, known as Artemis Pythie, in company with those made to Apollo at Didyma. And the point there that's especially important is that those sacrifices were made in company with both of the recipients. She was known by the epithet Artemis Pythie, again connecting her to Apollo Pythios. She also was known here, there's evidence at Didyma, she was known there as Artemis Leukeia, most likely to pair her with Apollo Leukeos. So the connection between the two went much deeper than simply their sibling relationship. They were closely connected at Didyma, the target of the Sibyl. So, in summary, we've seen that the Sibyl of Book 5 mounted a polemic against Apollo and against the prophetic work at the oracular site of Didyma. The attack, however, began not with Apollo, but the attack began with an attack on Artemis, which then led to a series of interlocking wordplays, ultimately taking the attack to Apollo. This entire attack was contained within the ecclesial brackets of Apollomy, setting off Apollo as the target. Historic, geographic, and material data clearly point to Didyma and the oracular function of Apollo there as the target of the Sibyl. So the Sibyl used the Sibylline, the goddess, Artemis, to link to and engage this polemic against oracular Apollo. Thank you.